Morena, good morning to you both, Andrew and Arthur. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. Welcome to our 2023 LIANZA conference.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to start with a few introductions just so that we understand who our lovely speakers are today. Andrew Pettegree is a professor of modern history at the University of St Andrews and one of the leading experts on Europe during the Reformation. He's the author of the prize-winning The Book in the Renaissance and The Invention of the News, among other publications. He's a former vice president of the Royal Historical Society and the founding director of the Universal Short Title Catalogue. Anda de Weduwen is a lecturer at St Andrews and deputy director of the Universal Short Title Catalogue. He's the author of several books on the history of newspapers, advertising and publishing. I understand he owns a small library of 17th and 18th century books, which, as the research for the library has shown, is probably sadly doomed to be dispersed. Although I have to say that I'm sure amongst our audience we will find many, many grateful homes for those works, should that happen. So your book, The Library of Fragile History, the book explores the contested and dramatic history of the library, right through from the famous collections of the ancient world, right through to the often embattled public resource that we cherish today. And along the way, we're introduced to antiquarians and philanthropists who shaped those world's great collections. The book traces the rise and fall of fashions and tastes, and most intriguingly for me, also reveals some of those high crimes and misdemeanors that were committed in the pursuit of rare and valuable manuscripts. It's a delight to be able to talk to you both, and I did have a most wonderful time reading the book, which I have a copy of with me here. So thank you for joining us at the conference. So let's get started into a few questions for our authors. Now, The Library, A Fragile History. The book title's really striking because many of us, I think, in the profession, we generally think of libraries as being, quite robust and quite continuous through time. But as we see in the book, the buildings and the contents have actually, they're often proven to be quite fragile, whether it's through war or neglect, fire, changes in political views and religious views. But that concept of the library's been quite resilient over time. So what is it that makes that library concept so timeless?
Well, it's very interesting to have to talk to you and your New Zealand colleagues about this, because I think there is a very different context in Australia and New Zealand to the one we're facing certainly in Britain at the moment, though not throughout Europe as a whole. And that is, people are genuinely worried whether the public library as an institution has a future. It's partly because of the governance issues and the way libraries are funded here, that they're left to local councils to fund. And the local councils now have so many statutory responsibilities of things they have to put first, that their library budget is one of the few things which they can manipulate to try and balance the books. So people are genuinely worried here that the age of the public library may be coming to a close, and some local authorities have in fact begun to use the digital excuse to actually get rid of all their hardcover books altogether. Having said that, I think the fragility in our title has to do with the way in which libraries have come and gone. I would say 99% of all the libraries that have ever been formed no longer exist. And actually, I think understanding what we mean by a library has in fact been a relatively recent thing. The search for the public library went on for something like 4 centuries after the invention of print, before public libraries became a major phenomenon in the second half of the 19th century, which of course was the time when libraries were beginning to be formed also in Australia and New Zealand. So in a way, it's a more continuous history in those places than it has been in Europe.
that figure, thinking about 99% of libraries, that have probably ever been and no longer existing, is just, it's simply quite staggering, isn't it, to think of that scale?
Yeah.
So throughout the book, it's really evident that over time, different topics in that library collection, those library collections have often kind of been targeted, sometimes for religious or moral reasons. What kind of lesson should we take from the history of libraries? Because often they've both provided and purged content, in the face of increasing objections to certain topics that we have in our collections today.
No, thank you. It's a great question, and I'm sure it will be of relevance to many of the people listening here today, because this is now such an important topic that's constantly being discussed in the library community, and it's being reported all the time in the media too. I think if history of book collecting and libraries shows you anything, is that the debate of what belongs in libraries will definitely continue. It's always been there. I don't think we are necessarily living now in a more censorious age in which people in which people are seeking to remove more books from libraries than before, because as soon as you open a collection of books to a select number of people, there will be a conversation about what books actually should belong there. And that's especially the case when collections are funded with collective or public sums of money, because if you have a personal collection, that's in many ways you have the right to decide what goes in it, and no one can really tell you should own this book or you shouldn't. But as soon as we're saying, as a community, we want to provide books for this community, these people, whatever, there is a sense of saying, if I'm going to invest in it, I do want people to have the right types of books. And we've seen that through the classical age. We've seen that in monastic libraries in medieval Europe. We see it in the era of the Reformation, of course, with a conflict between Catholics and Protestants. You see it in the first university libraries, where there's a sense that the only proper books to be held in there have to be proper scholarly books and books in the Latin tongue. Very famously, the great Bodleian Library, its founder Thomas Bodley, declared that he didn't want idle books and riffraff in his great library, by which he didn't mean romantic books of romance, but he meant books in the English language in general. So that would include milestones of literature like William Shakespeare. So what belongs in a library has always been up for debate. But if I might add a second lesson from history, is that purges of institutional collections or publicly available collections might be successful in their operation, but they are rarely successful to truly purge literature from the world and from people's hands. It's especially difficult, and this is something we emphasize in our book, because private collection and personal collecting is so important to the history of the library. So if a group of people or a government takes aim at a certain book, it might be easy to take them temporarily out of public libraries, but not necessarily out of homes. So I think we'll continue to see that in the future too.
Gosh, that's interesting, that endurance, isn't it? Despite often the best efforts of religious institutions or governments to try and curtail certain content, that actually in many ways that content lives on, often through private collections and things. I also do believe that idle books and riffraff would make an excellent title for excellent name for a secondhand bookshop. I feel as though there's some real opportunity there. I think he was onto something.
I think you're right, and it hasn't been taken as far as I know yet. So if anyone out there has the money to start the bookshop, go for
it. So while and I guess this kind of goes into the next question, because while that concept of the library has kind of remained quite robust over time, the reasons why a library might be established or why someone might want to establish a library has sort of evolved continually. So people have built libraries because they're lovers of books or manuscripts, but they've also used them as political and religious tools, or sort of to inculcate a certain, social or moral standard. And perhaps particularly relevant for an Aotearoa New Zealand audience, the early days of libraries here were really kind of both a tool for providing diversion to the new immigrants, and really with the hope of keeping them out of trouble and keeping them out of the pub. But also kind of a real tool of colonisation, where English ideas were held up as kind of a civilised standard. So what are your thoughts about that the modern drivers on why we continue to develop libraries. What role do we kind of ascribe to libraries in society, and what are the roles that you've observed that librarians and libraries play, even those roles that aren't necessarily stated out loud?
Yes, well, I think you're absolutely right. I think for the first millennium of libraries from the Roman Empire onwards, it was normally about great men talking about themselves. I mean, libraries functioned far more as a memorial of their generosity than as a community hub where people could go and get books. In fact, this is the whole difficulty of establishing what the public library is, because you first have to establish what the public is, and that wasn't easy at all. You know, Cardinal Mazarin was famous for opening up his library one day a week to visitors, but those visitors would only be favored humanist scholars. It'd be a very small number. It wouldn't be the public. So actually establishing what the public is has been one of the major tasks of what we could call the modern library movement from, let's say, the 1870s onwards. And for a long time, people thought that didn't include children, that when they had a children's room or a juvenile's room, that was normally intended for advanced teenagers more than little kids, who were by and large kept out of the library altogether. But I think one thing that has been fairly constant through this has been the idea of libraries as a community hub. It's very interesting that when new communities formed, let's say in the American West, that when the opportunity came to have a library, they would give it very prominent space in the town center, on the town square, close to the bank, close to the church. And it was regarded as one of the major municipal buildings. Hence, it was often a rather grand and large building. And I think that's why, of course, libraries have been most vulnerable to any sort of conflict, particularly when bombing became a possibility in the Second World War, because libraries suffered not necessarily because they were targeted, though sometimes they were, but because they were in the most vulnerable space, that is the town center, where, it must be said, they were doing essential war work. They were handing out all the information that people needed in wartime, all the new regulations. They were acting as community space. They were where you came to make your donations to the Red Cross. They were work parties could get together, knitting socks. And that sort of sense of the library as a hub of the community really grew during wartime and has been with us ever since. There was a rather visionary survey of the future of libraries in Australia, I think in 1976, where they established precisely these purposes, somewhere people could go, somewhere where, in the recent energy crisis, somewhere where people could find a warm room to sit in, somewhere where people could, the lonely could go to meet other people, where groups could meet. And now, of course, where they can find computers, particularly when we spoke to branch librarians when we were first working on our book, we found that helping people with filling in official forms online was now one of their major purposes. So the idea of the community center is so strong that you begin to wonder, where do books fit into this? But, you know, it's hard to envisage a library without books.
It strikes me too, as you talk about that definition of, you know, what is the public? I think also that idea of, you know, what is the community has also really changed over time as well. Obviously, some of those early book collectors, you know, they sort of thought of themselves as kind of open to the public, but the public was not really the public. It was that much smaller and quite elite kind of community. They were creating a community hub, but for a very specific group of people.
Yeah.
So probably both historically and today, that development of new libraries is often down to, you know, kind of having a rich or a powerful benefactor, or both, often, who might sort of ascribe to some of those improving kind of, notions. They might have social or political motives that we've just sort of talked about. What arguments do you find have the most sway in convincing people that libraries are positive and useful institutions, both kind of historically and today, particularly when we're looking to expand or redevelop buildings and collections and services? We're always sort of thinking about what are the arguments that help to sway people in favour of what we're trying to do.
No, it's an excellent question, and let me say first, I think that when you look through the history of libraries, that one of the things we've certainly noticed is, I think ultimately libraries that don't appeal to a wide enough reader base or user base, they wither away and die. So many libraries, as you mentioned, were founded with some sort of improving goal in mind, or at the behest of a great benefactor who was probably more interested in honoring their own legacy than actually providing books that people might want. And although lots of those libraries pop up throughout history, I don't think they really have lasting or staying power. So they really need to connect with a user base in order to have a function and to stay alive. So for what makes, what arguments can we say that makes libraries positive and useful? I think a lot of it goes back to your previous question, and that comes down to librarians. I think, libraries with fantastic stock and fantastic collections that are only open one afternoon a week, like many of the early university libraries were, for example, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, might be brilliant for the books they hold, but no one can ever access them or read them properly. Having good library space and expert and friendly staff to guide people through it is one of the key things that makes libraries a welcoming and positive environment. I think connected to that, I think what makes libraries so useful is this, and I think something that needs to be protected in libraries, is this sense of browsability and discoverability, in the sense that, especially today, with the internet at our hands, we can search for anything we already know of, or what we know that we already want to have. I think a good library provides space to find the unexpected and to really go and browse through shelves, browse through stacks, speak to a librarian for advice on what you might want to read next, or discuss a particular author or genre, and you go on a journey into something new and into something you hadn't necessarily thought of before. And I think that's an incredibly precious thing in an age when we are totally saturated by possibilities of information and possibilities of knowledge. So I think that is something critical, and that ultimately ties back to my first point just now. I think libraries are most useful when they provide help when needed, but not necessarily providing a certain doctrine to everyone who steps through the door. So the improving mission was always part of library motives, but I think it should probably take a bit of a back step now, and instead be led by what readers want and what by library users need, rather than what necessarily a benefactor or even library management think is good for the community or good for people.
And that's often been one of the challenges, hasn't it? That librarians have sometimes seen that role, I guess, in the past of being able to kind of control and shape the collection and therefore the communities in certain ways, which does beautifully lead me on to my next question, thank you, which is part of the book, particularly at the end, there was a section I found really fascinating, and it was about the more recent role of libraries and librarians and social and political movements, and it touched on sort of areas right from the American Library Association, the ALA and the Patriot Act, through to the role of libraries and patriotic kind of war efforts, which we touched on before, to the real lack of resistance over disapproved books during those wars, and actually being quite, often quite willing to sort of give those away. And then right through to the hands-off approach that was really taken to social justice for African American readers during desegregation in the American South. And so increasingly we sort of see libraries become flashpoints for these social issues. And we see it a lot in the US, obviously, and we get a lot of reporting out of there about what's going on. But we also see that with protests over things like rainbow story times in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So what what lessons does history have for us about how, maybe how and to what degree libraries and librarians should be involved in these social issues and issues of social justice? How do we kind of balance these spinning plates, I guess, of neutrality, kind of freedom of speech and social justice? How do we handle those things together?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. I think we all have duties as citizens, and not just in the occupations we occupy. And I think we should all be interested in social justice. On the other hand, I think that libraries have to be sensitive to the fact that we're in an age of very rapid social changes in our attitudes to different social issues. And we should be sensitive to the fact that not everybody goes at the same speed. So I think that we should be very aware of social justice, very aware of changing patterns of speech, behavior, and interests, but not ignore the fact that this is easier for some, particularly the highly educated members of our community, to attune themselves to, than it is to others of our citizens for whom the public library is a very important resource. It's always been the case, since the public libraries have been a factor in their lives in the 19th century, that many of the ideal readers, the people that public libraries want to reach most, are actually quite conservative, both in their reading tastes and their social issues. And this remains the case in Britain, where the elderly are an absolute, the absolute cornerstone of readership in our libraries. And if we ignore their tastes or make them unwelcome, then there will be actually relatively little justification for keeping many of these branch libraries in particular open. I was in a library in Bedfordshire and talking to the librarians there, and I saw a great stand of Mills and Boon romantic novels there. And they said that many of their readers come in every week, give back a handful, and go out with a handful. And that was their reading material. And who are we to look down on it? And I was then in another library in a rather more yuppie-ish part of South London. And there was a poster which said, romantic novels we've just accessioned, and not a Mills and Boon in sight, as if we should despise that sort of reading. And I thought that was entirely the wrong approach. You know, if we want society to be cohesive, as we certainly do, and we can think of some examples of societies which are not very cohesive because of social issues, then we have to understand that there are some people who will not change at the rate of us. So yes, I think we should be aware of social justice, but I think we should not attempt to be in the forefront of campaigning without being aware that not all our citizens can keep pace with us.
Do you think it's a matter of the sort of theory that people often used to have was that if you tempted people into the library to read the sort of books that they enjoyed, that eventually they would, move on to other more worthy literature? Do you think there's anything to that in terms of the social justice issues, that we are, providing the things that our community wants, and whether that's Mills and Boon or other topics, and we're happy to provide those. Do you think there's any credence to that theory, that people then do move on to other topics or become more open to other topics through their exposure to that in the library?
Yes, I do. I do think there's some truth in that, but it depends a great deal in whether people are made to feel welcome in the space or not. In the 19th century, the whole purpose of the public library movement was to make intelligent citizens of the new industrial poor. There was this vast increase in industrialization, And all these people would soon have votes. They certainly had political opinions. They read newspapers. So they should be educated in their duties of a citizen. It was very paternalistic, rather patronizing. But then when they got to public libraries, they found the system demanded them to ask a librarian to get them a book. They had to expose their tastes to people who looked rather disapproving. The whole business of silence in libraries was also very hard for these new readers. And so instead, they went to alternative services, the tuppenny libraries in the corner shop, circulating libraries, because they would give you what you wanted to read without seeming to pass a judgment. So I think all of this has to be subtle, and we have to be extremely sensitive towards people who haven't got there yet. I should also say that the whole history of libraries is tied up with religion. All through our history, I would say until the Second World War, religion was a moving force in virtually every aspect of life. The idea that along came the Enlightenment and then everything else was forgotten is just really complete nonsense. If you look at people's reading habits in the mid-19th century, the leading books that were the reading of the middle class was Robinson Crusoe, the Bible, and Pilgrim's Progress. And so texts that were centuries old were dominating people's reading then. So we have to take this into account. You know, not everybody is moving at the same speed.
That's a really great point. So, Andrew and Arthur, I'd like to do something a little bit different. I would like to do a wee quick fire round with you both and ask you some very short questions. And so for this, the format for this quick fire round is really to provide me with a couple of words, a couple of words, maybe a sentence or two in response to the questions. So, and I'd like answers from both of you, if that's all right. So, first question, can you give me one word that you think will characterize what you think the future of libraries will be?
Well, I'll go first then, if that's all right. And my word would be diverse, because I think that in terms of where the library is moving, I think there's going to be ever greater and different forms of libraries in existence, both in terms of private collecting, but also definitely public collecting.
Fantastic. Andrew?
I would say uncertain, because I think the problem libraries face is that most of the people who are most passionate supporters of libraries are often not themselves users of them.
That's a really good point. So what's a topic about libraries that you think deserves more research?
Private collecting. The history of libraries has often been written as a history of buildings and institutions, whereas, you know, by far the largest proportion of books are sitting in people's homes. So collectively, we have a massive library, and that's why libraries can so easily be rebuilt after disasters.
And I would say probably the relationship between libraries and bookshops. This is something that we do highlight a little bit in our book, but I think deserves a lot more attention. Just first of all, in the way that bookshops have provided stock and content to libraries, the way they've shaped them, but also in the ways that the forms have often merged, where many, especially in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, many bookshops were also offering lending libraries themselves.
Fantastic. So who is another author, besides yourselves, that you think has good insights into libraries?
Well, I might offer two, just to because our book covers such a chronological expanse. First, for the early modern period, definitely Edward Wilson Lee, who's written a fantastic book on the son of Christopher Columbus and his book collecting. Really one of the great collectors of the Renaissance. And probably another for the 20th century, probably Wayne Wiegand at Florida State University. Really brilliant expert on especially American public libraries in the 20th century.
Andrew, did you have a recommendation for us?
Yes, this might sound slightly off-piece, but I would recommend Jonathan Rose and his book, The Intellectual Life of the British Working Classes, book which is full of libraries. And one of the rare books that I'm reading now, and I'm positively ashamed never to have read it before. But it is just a stupendous book, full of research, full of interest, and full of profound insight.
Is there a question that you wish people would ask you about the book but never have?
Yeah, well, I wish. Oh, Andrew, you go first. I'm interested to hear what you say.
Okay, well, certainly the question we were very well prepared for, and no one has asked, is what's it like writing a book as co-authors? And we were incredibly well prepared for this. But so if there's time, I'll give you a short description of what it's like, but I'll let Arthur have his turn first.
Excellent.
Well, it's very similar to Andrew's, but I was going to say, Arthur, is it true you did write the entire book? But to which the answer would have been, I'm afraid not. No, we did write it together properly. So
yeah, well, Arthur's time will come, because he'll have 40 years to go around the world saying, do you know, I wrote it all myself. But the actual process is there's a pub in St Andrews we go to with an envelope, and then we write on the back and we divide the chapters between us. And then when you write a chapter, it goes to the other. They send it back with track changes. And this is the crucial bit. You accept all the changes without argument. And so, no, we've never had a row about any of our writing. And I think it shows you have to have a high degree of trust in the other author. But I'm told this is how Ben Elton and Richard Curtis wrote Blackadder. So,
oh my goodness. Well, you're in good company then, I think. Gosh. And is there a part, I mean, there were some parts of the book that were, you know, actually kind of positively dramatic. So do you think there's a part of the book that would make a good movie?
Well, I think it would, you'd have to choose a part of the book which has a handsome young intellectual, so that there was a leading role for Arthur. I don't think it would work otherwise.
Well, I might say that I would certainly recommend the chapter on the rise of antiquarian collecting, chapter 12, which sees quite a lot of scholars, young and old, it should be said, Andrew, get hold of very rare manuscripts in fantastic book collections by very unscrupulous methods, and there's a lot of backstabbing and rivalry and queens and kings. I mean, it's got everything, I think. So, you know, if anyone, I know the Hollywood writers are on strike at the moment, but who knows? They might come off strike in the future, and then who knows what might happen.
That's right. I think you have a good pitch there. I think you need to give a go. That might be the next project to do in the pub near St Andrews, I think.
Well, I can tell your members that the movie rights are still available. Remarkable.
Good opportunities for someone here.
Yep,
wonderful.
certainly.
That's fantastic. So just as a final question, as we come to the end of our time together, what do you see as the next major development for libraries? What is it that we should be planning for in the future?
Don't give up on books. I was down at the publishers this week because I've got another book in the works, and I asked the lifetime sales of this, and less than 5% of the total sales were of either the audiobook, which is excellent, and the ebook. 95% of the people who buy the Library of Fragile History have a hardcover book. And so I think those who've tried to get ahead of the curve by going deep into digital have taken, I think, probably a misstep and a risk. And the risk, of course, we saw all too clearly in the Northern Hemisphere when the Russians invaded Ukraine, where the electricity, the power on which digital resources rely, suddenly seemed far less secure than we thought. In fact, in South Africa, there's already 6 hours of electricity blackouts per day in 3 2-hour stretches. So if we're relying on a source which we may not have, I think one day all my students may be knocking on my door, holding their candles, saying, "Can I borrow one of your books?"
Yeah, I think very, very similar to Andrew, and that would probably be just beware false prophets of technological change. I think we see that in every media and technological revolution. There's always people out there trying to make money with the new invention and new models, and they big themselves up for their careers, for profits, in order to get that through. But as we've seen with the sort of rise and fall of microfilm and microfiche, books, print, the physical artifact will probably outlast all its other technological competitors, I think. So keep hold of your books.
Fantastic, great advice, thank you. Well, it's been a delight to talk to you both, Arthur and Andrew, this morning. Ngā mihi nui kia kōrua. Thank you both for being here with us at the 2023 LIANZA conference.
Well, thank you very much. And if I may just say to all your colleagues, we're making a major push at the moment to try and get more libraries into the Universal Short Title Catalogue. And we would particularly welcome approaches from New Zealand libraries who have books printed before 1701, so that we can get them fully represented in the Universal Short Title Catalogue.
Yep. And just to say thank you to you, Laurinda, as well. Lovely speaking to you.
Lovely to speak to you both. Thank you.